Everyone out there. It is both an honor and a pleasure to welcome Professor Ritchie Robertson, who is joining us to speak about his brand new book, The Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness, 1680 to 1790, out with HarperCollins, just hot off the press. Professor Robertson is professor of German at Oxford University, a fellow of the British Academy, and a lead reviewer for the Times Literary Supplement. So here to give Professor Robertson a proper introduction is my colleague, Alexander Schmidt. Alexander is our new DAAD Visiting Associate Professor of European Studies here at Vanderbilt University. So he started just this past January. He's held visiting professorships and fellowships at the University of Chicago, Cambridge, the University of Edinburgh, and before coming to Vanderbilt, he has taught intellectual history at the Friedrich Schiller University, Jena in Germany. And Alexander's work focuses on the history of German political thought, especially the long 18th century, with an emphasis on the intersection between ideas of human nature, legal thought, and aesthetics. And again, just to welcome everyone who's coming in, this special event is sponsored by the Max Kade Center for European and German Studies at Vanderbilt University. The Kade Center regularly holds webinars like these, and if you'd like more information, please seek it out on the internet. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Very warm welcome to everyone to our webinar sponsored. Again, we cannot repeat that enough, by the Max Kade Center for European and German Studies. I'm delighted to briefly introduce our guest today. Ritchie Robertson, as Lauren mentioned, is the Taylor Schwartz Professor of German Language and Literature and a Fellow at Queen's College at Oxford. He holds a D.Phil from Oxford for his dissertation on a Scottish poet, Edwin Moore. Before he was appointed to the Taylor Schwartz chair, he held positions at Lincoln College, Oxford, Downing College, Cambridge, and St. John's College, Oxford. He was twice a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and held visiting professorships at the Freie Universität Berlin and the Queen's University in Canada. And he is also a fellow of the British Academy. Ritchie has a stupendous wide range of interests, largely in German literature, roughly from Lessing to Kafka and Thomas Mann. And the question of how this expertise and perspective of a literature scholar informs the present book will, I believe, also come up in our discussion. Many in our audience, I hope, will be familiar with his books on Heinrich Heine, Kafka, Goethe, his 2009 study on mock poetry from Pope to Heine, and his monograph on the Jewish question in German literature of 1999. Besides these single-authored works, Professor Robertson has edited and co-authored a number of widely received collections of essays, all of which cannot be listed in a time allowed, so I'm going to name but a few. The Cambridge Companion to Thomas Mann, 2002, A History of Austrian Literature, 2006, Lessing and the German Enlightenment of 2014, and Isaiah Berlin and the Enlightenment. Ritchie, thank you for agreeing to discuss this truly marvelous book with us. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexander, both for the invitation and that very kind introduction. And thanks to Lauren for acting as co-host and to Ali for setting up the Zoom link, which, touch wood, appears to be working. And I'll say a bit about how I came to write the book and what I was trying to do in it. I ought to say for a start, the book was not my idea. I would not have dared to propose a book on the Enlightenment, on such a massive topic, all by myself. I was approached by the director of Penguin Books in the UK, Stuart Profit, who is well known to be a publisher of genius I fully believe that, he somehow discerned that I had a book in the Enlightenment in me and wanted to get it out. He was right, because although writing the book was in many ways very arduous, it came out quite easily. Everything fitted together and slotted into place. Now, what was I trying to do? Well, first, to get beyond my own comfort zone, I'm a professor of literature. I do quite a lot in comparative literature and also in the history of ideas. I began, as I usually do with projects, by homing in on what was most difficult. So I began with a chapter on political economy and sat down to read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And for some time I had the pleasant illusion of actually understanding something about economics. But I had my own take on the Enlightenment, which developed as I went along. First, to start with something which ought by now to be pretty obvious. I wanted to combat the well-known cliché of the age of reason by showing that, yes, enlighteners, Aufklärer, did set immense store by reason, and rightly so, but also by emotion, sentiment, sympathy, and sensibility. At the very beginning of the 18th century, we have the philosophy of Shaftesbury, and after him, a whole succession of philosophers who examine the emotions, including Adam Smith, whose theory of moral sentiments, 1759, is a necessary counterpart to the Wealth of Nations. And I also wanted to make it quite clear that reason in the 18th century is not rationalism. The idea that you can deduce all information about the world by quasi-mathematical reasoning belongs to the 17th century, to the age of Descartes and Spinoza. The Enlightenment turned intellectual inquiry on its head. Instead of deductive reasoning, in which you start with an abstract principle and argue down to actual phenomena, the Enlightenment proceeded inductively. We started from the phenomena, from looking empirically at the world, and gradually advanced from there to general principles. You can find that set out in the preface by d'Alembert to the great Enlightenment undertaking, the Encyclopédie, the complete guide to arts and sciences, directed amid immense difficulties by Diderot, and completed in the mid-century. But that was fairly obvious. I also wanted to make clear that the Enlightenment was not homogeneous. The Enlightenment consisted of arguments. If you got a room full of enlighteners, they'd soon be quarreling, even if, in a sense, they were ultimately on the same side. To take just one example, an obvious enlightened cause, you might think, was the abolition of capital punishment. And I've given a lot of attention in the book to Cesare Beccaria and his treatise on crimes and punishments. But there was also an Enlightenment case for capital punishment, resting on the dignity and autonomy of the subjects. A number of fallacies and misunderstandings result from seeing the Enlightenment too much in relation to our present-day preoccupations. Historians call this presentism, and I realize, looking back, that in all my books, I've tried to escape from presentism and enter into the perspective of the past. You always have to have a dual perspective. You can step out of your skin. I can't stop being a 21st century person. And what I try to do is to manipulate two perspectives that of the present and that of the past. If we look at the Enlightenment, pardon me, too much in the light of present-day concerns, we risk underestimating the enormous importance of religion in the Enlightenment. Religion, whether they were for or against it, was an absolutely crucial battleground. And again, we tend too easily to assume that the Enlightenment was a major episode in the history of secularization, in the development of a secular outlook on the world. Well, that's a much disputed view. I've engaged with it in the book, and I do basically believe in the secularization thesis, but I have tried to modify it in what I hope is a subtler way. What people tend not to realize is that in the Enlightenment, serious disbelief in religion, atheism, was actually very unusual. And those who were, or almost certainly were, atheists, like Diderot or Hume, did not publicize their opinions. Many of the best-known Enlighteners were deists, including Voltaire. That is, they believed that God existed, he was benevolent, he was the source of good, he had created the world, but having created it, he had gone away and left it to its own devices. And these devices have been best explained by Isaac Newton's cosmology. So you certainly find in the Enlightenment very widespread condemnation of the false authority assumed by representatives of the churches, of false history and meaningless theology resting on the supposed authority of Scripture. The Enlighteners judge religious claims against the criteria of ascertainable fact. Now, we can perfectly well talk about the religious Enlightenment, the title of a recent important book by David Sorkin at Yale. And in the last few years, there's been a lot of research on the Catholic Enlightenment, to which I've contributed in a small way. So, to appreciate the importance of religion is one way to escape from mere present-mindedness. Another word that tends to be abused in studies of the Enlightenment is the word democracy. It would be nice to think that the Enlighteners are working towards something that resembles democracy in our sense. But the idea of universal adult suffrage seldom, if ever, entered their heads. Even the founding fathers of the United States didn't want unrestricted democracy. Not only were women, and of course slaves, denied the vote, but as we all know quite well, they invented an electoral college, so that if the popular vote produced a maverick, or obviously unsuitable candidate, the electoral college could substitute another. How well that works in practice is something I leave to other people to discuss. The Enlighteners tended to assume not that grassroots democracy could be a real practice, but rather that freedom, reform, would be handed down from on high by absolute rulers. The absolutists, the enlightened monarchs of the 18th century, were those to whom the Enlighteners looked for reform. I need instance only Frederick the Great of Prussia, with whom Voltaire had a stormy relationship, Catherine the Great of Russia, who invited Diderot to St. Petersburg, and my favorite example, the Emperor Joseph II of Austria, who tried to bring in quite radical reforms, religious toleration, the abolition of censorship, freedom of the press, in a very precipitate way, and thereby brought about a reaction among his ungrateful subjects. And of course, the theory that absolute monarchs would introduce reforms was disproved by the example of France. Voltaire had to admit by about 1770 that the dysfunctional French economy and the obviously unjust privileges of the aristocracy and the church were not going to be swept away, certainly not by the well-intentioned but weak monarchs of the time. So the French Revolution, unfortunately, had to happen. The pent-up energies had to burst out, and the result was the sweeping measures instituted by the National Convention, abolishing feudalism and dispossessing the church on a single evening. They sat up enacting this legislation until 2 a.m. And when you read the dry minutes of the meeting, you can still feel something of the excitement that the members felt in doing all this. Their amazement that it was possible and they were getting away with it. That leads me on to another fallacy, which is perhaps not often articulated, but sometimes present as an unspoken assumption, that the Enlighteners were working towards revolution, that they got together in societies, including societies of Freemasons, consciously planning to subvert the social system. That is not true. The Freemasons even seem to be much less politically important and influential than often alleged. I think perhaps when we study the Enlightenment, we easily suffer the temptation of present-day intellectuals to imagine a time when intellectuals were effective, since intellectuals most of the time have a painful consciousness that nobody listens to them. When the revolution came along, most of the Enlighteners disapproved. Voltaire was dead by then, but the other Paris philosophes, D'Holbach, Helvetius, and the rest, kept their heads down. The only major French enlightener who supported the revolution was Condorcet, who in fact was a member of the revolutionary government. But as we know, revolutions devour their children, and Condorcet eventually had to go on the run. He was betrayed by a servant, and he was guillotined. Now, the enlightened writers who really inspired the revolutionaries were, well, in fact, there was one above all, namely Rousseau. Rousseau quarreled with all the other Paris philosophes. He was the wild man of the Enlightenment. His ideas went off in quite other directions, but he is the writer to whom Robespierre refers continually. Now, you raised the question, Alexander, of how do I get from being a literary scholar to writing about the Enlightenment and masquerading as a historian? Well, one thing I wanted to do was to have and to convey some idea of what it was like to live in the Enlightenment, of what everyday life was like, and how the Enlightenment impinged on the lives of ordinary people. So the book doesn't begin with philosophy. I didn't want to hit the unsuspecting reader over the head with Locke, Shaftesbury, Kant, and so forth right away. It rather begins with the question of happiness. The guiding idea of the book is happiness and the possibility of happiness in earthly life. But I write, of course, about the obstacles to happiness, war, and above all, illness. Later in the book, I tell the story of how Josiah Wedgwood, the proprietor of the potteries in Staffordshire in England, had his leg amputated. He sat in an armchair, mildly sedated, and had his leg cut off below the knee. That was the only way which it could be done. And of course, warfare continued in the Enlightenment and the misery it causes. But nevertheless, enlightened rulers were increasingly conscious that the kingdom was not given to them just to play with or for self-aggrandizement, but they had a responsibility towards their subjects. Frederick the Great described himself, Voltaire held to this formulation, as the first servant of his people. Now, if you want to know how ordinary people lived and thought, what people nowadays call ego documents, that is, diaries and autobiographies and letters, are of enormous importance. And I've drawn liberally on these, but also literature. What people read, what they made of the reading, is crucially important. I said earlier that I gave a lot of attention to emotion, sensibility, and sympathy. Now, an important way to develop sympathy is to read novels. And one reviewer has already identified as the axis of the book the section about the great emotional novels of the mid-century: Richardson's Clarissa, Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse, and Goethe's Die Leiden des jungen Werther. All these are massively popular, and we have, therefore, a great many reactions in the forms of letters, including letters to the authors, and also what can be very revealing, fan fiction. So you have a great deal to go on there. And I am surprised, in fact, that historians still quite often do without literature. If you look at the enormous and incredibly erudite volumes by Jonathan Israel, you'll hardly find anything about literature. Admittedly, he has read so much that it would be uncharitable to criticize him for not finding time to read literature as well, but it is a bit of a gap. Now, people always ask me questions, and I'm sure that you will, about the dark side of the Enlightenment. I won't give away my answers just yet, but I do want to say that I've tried not to whitewash the Enlightenment, and try to give a somewhat grey picture of it. One last point. When working on this book, I became very conscious, not only of the banal fact that the Enlightenment was a long time ago, but the world of the Enlightenment was very, very different from our own. And I would say that there are two enormous barriers in particular separating us from the Enlightenment. One is the French Revolution. Since then, the idea has been impossible to get rid of that one route to political change has been violent revolution. That has generally worked very badly, but enlighteners like Voltaire believed much more in gradualism, and the idea of a violent overthrow seldom occurred to them. The other enormous barrier is the discoveries at the beginning of the 19th century of the true age of the earth. The man who counts here, that he barely comes into the book, is the French anatomist Cuvier, who examined fossil bones and concluded the Earth was far older than the 75,000 years, which even the boldest Enlightenment naturalists like Buffon dared to conjecture. And indeed, that the Earth had been shaped by a succession of cataclysms. Well, that raised a great many questions, but in the history of our understanding of the world, it was every bit as big a shake-up as the later intellectual revolution associated with Darwin. Now, I'll stop there. I was going to talk a bit about the various unanswered questions which I came across and which I still have no answer, but I think I've talked long enough, and it's time for members of the audience, whom I can't see, to have their say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ritchie.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good. So we would like to invite the members of the audience to ask their questions through the chat, I guess, the Q&A, and then we can read them. So, oh, I see. Okay, so we already have some coming in. And as folks think about their questions and kind of decide what to ask, I wanted to start things off by asking you to talk a little bit about what it was like to write this wonderful book, which is so learned and yet at the same time quite a light read. It appears daunting in its size, but is really a delight to read. So when you were conceiving of writing a book like this for a general public, what kind of concerns did you have with your research process? How did you have to go about deciding, what would fit in and what you would exclude? Oh, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Okay, right. Well, there's a whole armful of questions there. Let's see. Penguin Books are quite strict with me. I had, first of all, to produce a synopsis before I could get a contract. By the way, I had the help of an agent. I'd never had an agent before, but I felt that for negotiating with Penguin Books, I had to have somebody holding my hand. Anyway, and then I wrote a synopsis of the Enlightenment in 10 chapters, each with a different theme. In the writing, of course, the book expanded. There are now 14 chapters, and I had further thoughts as I went along. It was originally to be one chapter on religion, but it became simply too enormous. So I divided it into two. The first is called The Religious Enlightenment, title borrowed from David Sorkin. He's a friend of mine, I hope he won't mind. And the second is called Heterodoxy and Speculation, but it's really about the irreligious Enlightenment. Although my picture of the religious Enlightenment is quite irreligious too. Also, at quite a late stage, I thought of having a chapter on aesthetics. So I talk about theories of the arts, from classicism onwards, down to the expressive aesthetic that came in the late 18th century. Books of the Enlightenment don't usually deal with aesthetics. The only exception that comes to my mind is the book by Ernst Cassirer, The Philosophy of the Enlightenment, first published in German in 1932, which was a long and very good chapter on aesthetics. How did I manage to strike the tone? Well, it was actually very important for me in writing. I wanted to communicate with a non-academic public. That's very important. I wanted very much not to talk down to them. but take them seriously. I also wanted to write in a tone of voice which I felt was me, in which I was present. I think I managed, and I've striven very hard for clarity and to avoid any flourishes and anything that might seem pretentious. I've also, the advantage of not writing for academics is that certain requirements of academic writing can be forgotten about. There are, for example, certain concepts and certain names which in academic writing, one is expected to drop. Sometimes there are good reasons for doing so, but sometimes, as we know too well, it is mere name dropping to evade current gurus. Well, I have no patience with that in the best of times, and although the book is very heavily referenced, I think there are between 3,000 and 4,000 endnotes. Nothing's there for mere display. I try to get close to the texts on which the book is based. As a literary scholar, I believe very much in sticking close to the text. And as the book is based largely on a great variety of texts, literary and philosophical texts, histories, as well as personal writings, a great deal of the time is taken up with quoting, paraphrasing, discussing, evaluating, and sometimes criticizing the text that I write about. I hope that works. And I must say, the book was published in Britain in November, in the States last month. And one of the first American reviews I saw said that the reviewer was frightened when he saw the book and thought he would need a winch to get it onto his table. I hope it repaid the effort. He seemed to think so.
Wonderful.
Yeah, maybe I can sort of tune in with a question, and which also takes up a question posed by one of our hosts, Ari Joskovich, and which very much concerns what we understand by the Enlightenment. And I think sort of the formula you've chosen with sort of the pursuit of happiness and is concerned with the senses sort of happiness, both as maybe like a psychological state, but also like in a concern with providing the conditions for happiness, is a very comfortably wide formula. Sort of it allows to bring in kind of a wide debate, and also allows to bring together the theoretical debates with the practical efforts that we see in the Enlightenment, and also parts of what you describe in your statement, something like the experiences of more ordinary people. But then the question arises to a certain extent, what belongs into that sort of wider frame, and what sort of is out of that frame. And I thought like the case of Immanuel Kant is quite interesting in that respect, because on the one hand, it allows you to draw a certain line, and then like Kant's rejection of a morality which is sort of based on a certain understanding that sort of happiness is the highest good, and sort of also a rejection of ancient formulas for morality, allows sort of to see Kant as sort of both as an innovator, but also as someone with whom the Enlightenment ends. But so it very much makes sense to kind of end the Enlightenment, or in the 1790s, both with the French Revolution and sort of also, let's call it the anti-Enlightenment backlash, which arises largely in the 1790s, and also other cultural movements like Romanticism and so on. But then it's also very much the case that one of the key projects of the Enlightenment, namely bettering man's condition, is something that is mainly implemented in especially like in the German case, but also in the British and other cases, is actually in the early 19th century. If you look at the Rheinbund reforms in Germany, most of the aspirations of the Enlightenment, he kind of described this very well in a text, is often failures, are limited in their both in their scope but also in the means people these enlightened reformers pursue. Goethe would be a very good case in Weimar, who often kind of failed with some of his projects. And then you see many of these actually implemented in the 19th century. Pardon me. And also sort of with the legacy of the 19th century of the continuing reform movement of utilitarians in Britain, you would say the Enlightenment is much longer. So in one way, you could see it terminates in the 1790s, but it also stretches into the 19th century. And so I wonder a bit sort of how you engage with that question, sort of what should be part of our understanding of the Enlightenment, what is in and what is out, and especially when you include something like reforms, and then it maybe never ends with bettering our human condition.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alexander. You put your finger on at least three very important points. Let me say something on each in order. First, practical measures for happiness. Second, Kant. And third, the, as it were, afterlife of the Enlightenment. It was always important to me to regard Enlightenment not simply as an intellectual process, and not simply as a matter of debates among philosophers, but also as involving, pardon me, practical measures for human betterment and for human happiness, undertaken by administrators in Germany and France, using the keywords Polizei and police. When we hear about the 18th century German Polizeistaat, that of course sounds dreadful, but it has nothing or very little to do with the 20th century concept. The hundreds of German states all had a staff of administrators, and increasingly they were working for what they considered the good of the populace. Now, it's very easy to make fun of them. They issued lots of decrees, and it may be that the sheer number of the decrees shows that the decrees are often not followed, but they were concerned for things like infrastructure, roads and bridges, poor relief, healthcare, so far as that was possible in the 18th century, and education. Similarly, in France, I give some time to the administrator Turgot, who, as administrator of the Limoges province, was responsible for road building and similar infrastructural projects. There was, fortunately, plenty of work by historians that I could draw on, and I see now that these projects initiated by the state were the ultimate ancestor, and I owe this some insight, I must say, to your recent article, of the modern welfare state. Next, happiness and Kant. Kant is a sort of wild card in the book. You can't have the Enlightenment without Kant, and be Hamlet without the Prince. But at the same time, Kant's thought, by virtue of its originality, often goes in directions alien to the Enlightenment. Let me just give one example. A key text of the Enlightenment, which you know better than I do, is Schiller's Aesthetic Letters, 1795. Schiller, and it has this in common with the many scholars in late 18th century Germany who inquired into what was called anthropologie, the study of human nature. Schiller wants to arrive at a unified picture of human nature in which the body constantly interacts with the mind, and the ideal is a harmony between the two. A harmony which he thinks is very difficult to attain, but can be found in the state of aesthetic contemplation. Now, this idea of harmony is quite at odds with Kant. Kant always insists that the passions and desires must be controlled by the mind, or the phenomenal self by the noumenal self. Partly for that reason, Schiller, who was the first very much inspired by Kant, eventually went off him and wrote to Goethe that Kant reminded him of a monk who'd run away from his cell, but taken his atmosphere with him. But seriously, Kant's moralism, his insistence on the will, does run through the 19th century. Most of my chapters seem to end with Kant, and with some ways in which 19th century thinkers and writers carry this severe morality further. So Kant is quite a difficult person to have in the book, but absolutely indispensable. Third, the afterlife of the Enlightenment. Well, that, of course, is an enormous topic. Enlighteners didn't all die in the 1790s. One person to whom I give a little bit of attention, he's something of an embarrassment, is Jeremy Bentham, who went on working and writing till, if I remember correctly, the 1830s. When people deride the Enlightenment, when they complain that the Enlightenment really invented new forms of human oppression, the person they turn to is Bentham. He had this well-known idea for a panopticon, a kind of model prison, in which the prison governor would sit in the center, and the cells would be arranged in concentric circles, so that he'd be able to see everything that was going on. In fact, he was so keen on this idea that he thought it ought to be introduced for schools as well. So the teacher would sit in the center and be able to see if the schoolboys were misbehaving. And of course, if the schoolboys had all been separate cells, they wouldn't be able to copy from each other. Anyway, Bentham took the idea of the panopticon very seriously. He proposed it to Parliament, but Parliament, after extended consideration, turned it down, not because it was intrusive, but because Bentham imagined it as a money-making venture. And that Parliament in those days thought that private individuals should make money out of prisons. So Bentham, who may be a very odd sort of enlightener, but he was one, was still active. More acceptable, perhaps, by a long way, John Stuart Mill. And Mill deserves consideration, among other things, for taking Enlightenment ideas much further, and thinking of his essay on the subjection of women, which shows a very good understanding of the constraints on women. And I'm afraid fond as I am of the Enlightenment, it didn't do a lot for feminism. In fact, if anything, I may be digressing now, so I won't go on for long. If anything, feminism went backwards. In the age of rationalism, when the mind, as Descartes argued, was thought of as separate from the body, it's possible to argue, in a much used phrase of the time, that the mind has no sex. As we would say, the mind is not gendered. And in fact, it's in the 17th and early 18th century that you find learned ladies. Queen Christina of Sweden is the highest placed, but there are many more. And you can find a very good account of them in the recent book by Peter Burke, the Polymath, published last autumn. But with the growth of sensibility, it was widely claimed that women were dependent on their bodies, women were more emotional, they weren't good at thinking. You can find this in the essay Sur les femmes by Diderot. And it was thought reprehensible for a woman to acquire learning. Just to take one example, think of Goethe, the narrative of the beautiful soul in Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, where the beautiful soul, who the highly intelligent woman who writes her autobiography, says that if you thought of as a learned lady, eine gelehrte Frau, you're exposed to all kinds of ridicule. And I found further examples from people's experience. The Enlightenment certainly didn't answer every question, and as I say, it failed quite singularly to answer some. I might add that medical treatment, as opposed to medical speculation, didn't get very far in the Enlightenment. That's another gap. But if we're going to talk about the afterlife of the Enlightenment, then of course it extends very far. One would want, for example, to relate Thomas Mann to the Enlightenment. The Magic Mountain is, among other things, a plea for enlightenment. Of course, the ideal of the Enlightenment is treated in the novel with irony, in the person of Settembrini, but nevertheless, the novel is a plea for enlightenment against its opposite. That's just one example, but in fact, enlightened thinking goes on, fortunately, down to the present day. So although I would dispute any narrative of simple continuity from the Enlightenment to the present, the Enlightenment is a period from which we can, and still do, learn an enormous amount.
Great. Actually, this might be an excellent time to transition to some of the questions that are coming up on the Q&A. One of which actually relates to your most recent point, which is the this afterlife of the Enlightenment. So we have a question: do you have thoughts about how your book contributes to current discussions about the Enlightenment, universalism, religion, and difference, especially in Europe?
I naturally hope that it will contribute in a good sense, but I've been very cautious in the introduction and the afterword, let alone in the body of the book, about talking about the present. I will say this: one issue that we're all concerned with now in universities is diversity. We have to accept the diversity of our culture and face it in a positive sense. And here I want to defend the Enlightenment. Everyone knows that some leading Enlightenment figures who ought to have known better made statements which are absolutely racist. They were rebuked by their contemporaries. I have in mind Hume, whose well-known racist footnote was criticised by other Scottish philosophers, and Kant is not guiltless either. But against that, the Enlightenment did give equal treatment to a number of Africans who found their way to Europe. These are usually people who'd been taken as slaves, bought, impressed their abilities on their owners, and were given their liberty. One was the writer Ignatius Sancho, who was given his liberty in London, became a well-known man of letters, corresponding with Lawrence Sterne, and had his portrait painted by Joshua Reynolds. Another, in a humbler walk of life, was Francis Barber, who was the black servant of Samuel Johnson, and who's recently had a biography devoted to him, and very interesting it is too. Another in Germany was Wilhelm Amo, who came from what is now Ghana and became a professor at Halle. Now, I take from this that there was more acceptance in the 18th century of racial diversity than was the case in the 19th century, and the reason is obvious. The 19th century was the age of imperialism. Europeans had every vested interest in claiming that their colonial subjects were by nature inferior. And I believe it's a misreading of history to project 19th century imperialist racist attitudes back onto the 18th century. The 18th century wasn't perfect, but it wasn't so bad. As I'm on this topic, let me say too that one of the masterworks of the Enlightenment is the Histoire des Deux Indes, the history of the East and West Indies, written, or rather edited by the Abbé Raynal, with very large contributions from Diderot and from other collaborators. This is a massive 10-volume work, which is a survey of the growth of the European empires overseas, starting with the Spanish in America, going through all the European nations, pardon me, and ending on a note of hope, because, in fact, between its first edition and its third, the American War of Independence has broken out. And it ends by powerfully backing the Americans against European oppression. So the Enlightenment actually has a pretty good and anti-colonialist record. And that's something important for the present day. Incidentally, the Histoire des Indes is quite hard to get hold of. It's a massive book. I don't know of any handy modern edition. I used the edition on the shelves of the library in Göttingen, where I spent a year doing a vast amount of research for the book. But that's a classic, which some professor of French should try to bring back into circulation.
Good. Thank you so much. We have a number of questions that have come in. Alexander, did you want to?
Yes. Let me see. I think one of the, maybe Ritchie, you can answer that briefly. We have questions on, because the name has already been dropped, on your view of Jonathan Israel's work, but also a question about what you would suggest as kind of an introductory reading on the subject. So for someone who is kind of teaching that or studying the Enlightenment, and if you can sort of give us sort of a brief statement on these topics, and then we can move on to more questions.
Well, reading the second first, a busy person who doesn't have the time to read a 900-page book should get hold of the book by my namesake, although no relation, John Robertson, who until his recent retirement was professor of the history of political thought at Cambridge and is a real authority on the Enlightenment. Oxford University Press has the series Very Short Introductions. John wrote the very short introduction to the Enlightenment. It's absolutely packed with information, and every aspect of the Enlightenment and debates on the Enlightenment is fitted in there. I should warn you, he doesn't make it altogether easy for the reader, because he does what I tried not to do and knocks you on the head with some hard philosophy at the outset. Nevertheless, it's a very, very good, a very pithy book, and everything you might want to know is in there, albeit necessarily very briefly. Jonathan Israel. Well, I really don't want to knock Jonathan Israel. His book, his volumes, there are 7 volumes now on the Enlightenment, are a massive achievement. He's read everything in the way of philosophy and political theory. Political theory is what interests him most. They are an absolute mine of information. I must say, for example, that he has a very good long chapter giving an appreciation of the Histoire du design, which we've just been talking about. Now, the trouble with Jonathan Israel is not his truly amazing learning, but that in my belief, his books are tendentious. He believes in something called the democratic and radical Enlightenment, and he contrasts it with the mainstream Enlightenment or moderate Enlightenment, represented, for example, by Voltaire and Hume, which he thinks sold out to the status quo and to absolute monarchy. I could make other criticisms, but I think I really don't want to be ungenerous. His achievement is massive, and there is like the Himalayas. You can't get around it. You have to deal with it. That said, I do think that of his various books, the weakest is the one on the French Revolution. He tries to write an intellectual history of the French Revolution, whereas I would want to say that the French Revolution was first and foremost a political event. The economy and the social system of France entered a crisis to which there was simply no revolution. And the ideas which the revolutionaries adopted were almost beside the point, I think to say, at least less crucial, less effective than the political circumstances. I think Israel is my main example when I warn against present-mindedness. He very much, in fact, quite explicitly, sees the Enlightenment as a struggle for the ideals that we now know as universal suffrage, freedom of speech, and feminism. Well, I've already said that universal suffrage was not an Enlightenment idea, that the Enlightenment didn't do much for feminism, and certainly the Enlightenment made great strides in toleration. It's important to remember that the Enlightenment looked back on the religious wars of previous centuries, the very bloody religious wars of late 16th century France, the Civil War in England, and of course the 30 Years' War in Germany, which reduced the population of Germany by 1/3. They thought about these wars as we think about the Holocaust, and they thought never again. So they were very keen on finding ways in which the practitioners of different religions could coexist. But toleration was and is a very difficult subject, and I think free speech is a very difficult subject at the present day. To put it very simply, people shouldn't exercise the freedom of speech by shouting fire in a crowded theatre. You could think of other non-hypothetical examples. As for toleration, absolutely we must tolerate different religions. But there is something, I think, in the objection that Goethe made when he said, Dulden heißt beleidigen. To tolerate is to insult. If you tolerate something, you're implying that that something is bad, disagreeable, and you really wish it would go away. I think with Goethe, we find a first step towards an attitude of positive acceptance of other religions. I can say this while I'm here, mentioning something very good that Adam Smith says, tucked away in The Wealth of Nations. He thinks there ought to be a free market, not only in the economy, but there should also be a free market in religion. And for that, a country should have a great many religions, none of them very large or very powerful. They should all be on more or less equal footing and compete for adherence. Not at all a bad idea. But I think I'm rambling, so I'll be quiet and invite other questions.
Oh yes, we have one more question on sort of the topic you raised now. I actually read it out to you to make it simple. I wonder whether you would talk about fear. You write about the Enlightenment freeing people from the additional burden of imaginary terrors, such as witchcraft.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Today, says a paper I just read, moral panics, once the unintended outcome of journalistic practice, seem to have become a goal. End of quote. Autocrats and media create and exploit fear. What is there to learn from the Enlightenment about counteracting fear?
An excellent question. I think, first of all, fear, which media and politicians very often cultivate for their own ends, has to be combated by knowledge. The only way to defeat fake news is substitute real news gathered by responsible journalists. The enormous power of the media the present doesn't provide an answer of some off the ground in Enlightenment, although admittedly in quite a big way. The antidote to fear is knowledge. A kind of fear that the Enlighteners had a lot to say about was a fear that comes from superstition. Edison, in the Spectator, talks how families make themselves needlessly unhappy by foolish superstitions, like thinking it's bad luck to look at the new moon through a window. Samuel Johnson in 1770 says that such superstitions are now very much reduced. A false belief that made many people very unhappy was the fear of hell. I give many lurid examples, and indeed the fear of death. Everyone must make up their own minds how they approach death, but I've given a number of examples in the book of enlightened dying, which suggests that it is possible to approach death calmly and not in a spirit of terror. The best known example is Hume, who in his little autobiography, My Own Life, written a few months before his death, says calmly, I anticipate a speedy dissolution. You have examples there of good sense and fortitude, which did help people to face serious, shall we say, existential situations. So generally, yes. One antidote to fear is courage, and another antidote, always necessary, is knowledge. But how to mobilize those antidotes is another question.
Good.
I think Lauren is waiting to pose a question for
Please go ahead.
time now.
So Ritchie, you've alluded to kind of the darkness and the shadows. So before we end our session, I wanted to sort of, come back to, what do we do as scholars and as teachers in the classroom? What do we do with the fact that this age of enlightenment encompasses, both this important movement embracing happiness that you are laying out, but it also simultaneously is an era in which slave plantations in the Caribbean are, oppressing, millions, some 5 million Africans are transported by slave traders, many of whom are members of the most enlightened, societies. They're being traded by the English, the French, the Dutch. These states, the French state is heavily subsidizing the slave trade. So, I'm wondering sort of, how do we put those together, especially when some of these players are taking bits and pieces of Enlightenment ideas and repurposing them to justify what they're doing. And so there are slave traders who are turning to Locke, for example, to justify enslaving Africans whom they pretend are all prisoners of war, for example. There are plantation owners that are applying science and technology in order to maximize efficiencies, et cetera. So, how do you think, and this is a very genuine question, how do you think that we then can try to reconcile these? Is it that that these adaptations and applications of methods of practical policing, science and technology should be kind of hived off from the Enlightenment? Far off from economics, are these kind of like negative externalities or kind of intentional distortions? So what can you offer on this?
That's a very important question, and I would say, first of all, we have to know and face the facts. Recently, for example, a few years ago, it came to light that David Hume not only wrote disparagingly about what he called Negroes, but also advised a friend to invest in a slave plantation in the Caribbean. So he seems not to be at all shocked by slavery. Now, I think we have to say that people were a bit more morally obtuse. I think it would be a bit too easy to say that slavery and slave trade were taken for granted. They weren't taken for granted by everyone. The opposition to the slave trade grew up not among card-carrying Enlighteners, but more among Christians, and especially Quakers. I give the Quakers quite a lot of space in the book, partly, of course, not only, because my wife is a Quaker. First of all, one should be careful of hero worship. We may think very highly of the Enlighteners, I do, but we mustn't think that they were flawless. Second, I think we should inquire what was actually involved in liberating slaves. The founding fathers, some of them kept slaves. Jefferson, for example, He wasn't happy about it, but he felt as the slaves were his property and he was in debt, he couldn't get rid of so much property. Another founding father, if I remember correctly, Patrick Henry of Virginia, said frankly that it would be better not to have slaves, but it would be very inconvenient to do without them. I don't quite see why slaves couldn't have been converted into wage laborers. One of the Enlighteners who denounced slavery and the slave trade, Condorcet, who I mentioned earlier in another context, advocated the abolition of slavery, but not at a stroke. He thought that if slaves were suddenly set free, they would turn on their masters and massacre them. The French National Convention did liberate all slaves in French dominions, and one result was the slave uprising on Haiti. Now that we know a great deal about Toussaint Louverture, a very remarkable leader, we'll be much more sympathetically disposed. But nevertheless, it wasn't as straightforward an issue as one would wish. I think, too, without in the least condoning the moral blindness of many Enlighteners, we ought to ask about ourselves. In an episode of Star Trek, set several centuries into the future, Captain Kirk says proudly, we no longer keep animals as slaves. Well, let's come back to the present. We know about factory farming. We know the misery it inflicts on millions of animals, sentient beings who are as well able to feel pain as we are. Future generations will look back and condemn us for our excessive indifference to the plight of animals. I will say also that well, slavery is absolutely unquestionably an evil. What in the 19th century came to be called wage slavery was not always very much better. It was better because factory workers had a legal status and eventually they got the vote, but they had very, very little practical power. So I absolutely don't want to relativize slavery, but I think one ought to look at it nevertheless in a comparative context.
Thank you. Okay, we have one last question from one of our hosts, Ari Joskovitz, who was curious about the role that changes in statecraft and administration, curious about the role that those changes play in understanding the Enlightenment. And he writes, one way to approach this is to look at individuals who embody both such as civil servants who are crucial in some countries' Enlightenment, including Prussia, people like Dom. Did the Enlightenment as a phenomenon also of administrative thinkers influence some of the elements that have come up as typical, such as the emphasis on sensibility, induction, and rational emotion? So yeah.
I'm not sure that I can give a confident answer to that question, but I'm very glad that you mentioned Dom, Christian Wilhelm von Dom, who presented to the Prussian government in, I think, 1781, a plea for, well, ultimately for the emancipation of the Jews. The rather unfortunate term he used was the Verbesserung, the improvement of the Jews. But his argument was that Jews are, at that time, confined to petty trading and money lending. That naturally has a bad influence on their moral character. The way to improve them is to give them full civil rights and admit them to a full range of occupation. And then they're on the way to being worthy citizens. The argument against this, of course, is that people shouldn't have to prove the right to citizenship. Nevertheless, Dohm's treatise is a great step forward in Jewish emancipation. And it came from an administrator. As we're talking about Jewish emancipation, I must say too that the motives animating its advocates were not only benevolent or altruistic. By excluding part of the population from civil rights, you also prevent them from serving the state. You have a lot of able-bodied men who are excluded from a full range of professions and who can't serve in the army. 18th century administrators assumed it was very important to maximize the population and very important for as many able-bodied adult male members of the population as possible to contribute to the economy. That was also part of the reason why Joseph II in Austria dissolved a large number of monasteries, was the monks in contemplative orders were idle and contributed nothing to the national well-being. So you can see with administrators, motives of prudence and calculation, economic motives intermesh with humanitarian and benevolent motives. But I think the reform measures they propose are not devalued by their mixed motives.
Thank you, Ritchie. I think it's time to draw to a close here, but not without thanking Lauren for agreeing to chair this session, and Ari and the Max Kade Center for organizing, everyone for attending and posing questions. And of course, Ritchie Robertson for coming to our seminar and his wonderful book. I think the questions, what he proved today is that in his own words, the power of the Enlightenment still has to provoke debate. And I think this should be continued. And sort of I'm quite curious because I saw that you're actually, according to the Wikipedia entry, which, as you tell me, was written by yourself, authored by yourself. So it must be true that you're currently writing a book on Friedrich Nietzsche for Critical Lives series.
Yes.
So, which is perhaps one of the most interesting critics of, maybe let's call it the egalitarianism, and maybe also the idea of the pursuit for happiness in the 19th century. And we, in a way, look forward to this book and perhaps to another discussion. Then,
may I just say briefly, the book, which is due with the publisher in June, and all being well, will be out next year, is at pains not to sanitize Nietzsche, but also to show him with plenty of textual evidence as a proponent of the Enlightenment. Although he takes the Enlightenment into some very strange places.
Mm-hmm. I think that was partly also how he was read by Foucault in a way, as sort of continuing that project in a certain way as a critical project. But thanks everyone again. Thank you, Ritchie, and to be continued with Nietzsche, I hope, next time.
Well, thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.